Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Jeremy. I'll be leading these Monday night sessions this month. So as we were talking about last week, these sessions will be looking at practices and techniques for dealing with afflictive emotions, so emotions that cause us problems. Just excuse my computer sitting here, I couldn't get to a printer, so just ignore that. So we'll, as we did last week, we'll do some meditation, and I'll talk a bit, and I encourage you to ask questions as I go along. The Buddha was very made an emphasis on people being skeptical about things that he taught, and I think that's the best approach when learning about spiritual practice and philosophy and spiritual ideas. And so the idea is that you have an open mind but also remain skeptical. And the Buddha used the analogy of buying gold. So when you go to buy some gold, traditionally in ancient India, you'd test the gold by rubbing it and melting it down and beating it until you're certain that it's authentic. So I encourage people to treat his ideas in the same way. So you're encouraged to ask questions and be skeptical. So just put up your hand as I go along if you have any questions or comments. So the meditation we did last week was just on concentration, and as I said last week, there's two main types of meditation, which are concentration and analytical meditation. So concentration is just focusing your mind on one object without letting it wander, and analytical meditation is focusing your mind on a series of analytical points to analyze an idea or a afflictive emotion, like anger, for example. And so you use analysis to focus on that and then reach a conclusion through the analysis, and then you focus using concentration meditation on that conclusion. So we'll do that tonight in a meditation on compassion. And so we'll use analytical meditation and also concentration. And as I was saying last week, there's two main mental faculties or mental tools that we use when meditating, which are mindfulness and alertness. So mindfulness is remembering the object, keeping it in mind without letting it wander. And alertness is observing the concentration to see whether your mind has wandered or not. So there are two things that I would like you to get some understanding and experience of through the meditations we do this month. I think they're very important. And if we want to meditate, then we need to identify and use those mental faculties. So they're mental faculties that we have, but we may not have used them in meditation before. Okay. So firstly, just sitting in a comfortable posture. Also, please tell me if you can't hear at the back. Just put up your hand. So sit in a comfortable posture, which mainly means having your body relaxed, but also we need to be alert, so not sleepy. So sitting with your back straight helps you to remain alert. And with your eyes mostly closed, which helps to avoid distraction. But also your eyes are slightly open to allow some light through, which also helps to avoid drowsiness. So firstly, just bring your attention to your body and relax your body. Relax all the muscles in your body. And then bring your attention to your breath and just observe your breath moving in and out. So it can be helpful to focus particularly on the point underneath the tip of your nose, on the sensation of the breath moving in and out past that point. So try to focus just on that point for the duration of 9 breaths. So breathing in and out is 1 breath. So after 9 breaths, you check to see if your mind has wandered. And again, remember mindfulness, which is remembering the object, the chosen object of concentration, and alertness, which is observing to see whether the mind has wandered off or not. So now we'll do an analytical meditation on the practice of compassion. So we start the meditation firstly by contemplating the idea of equanimity, which means that all beings are fundamentally equal. So contemplate the idea that all beings are equal in that they are seeking happiness and trying to avoid problems. So the purpose of this meditation is to generate the idea or the feeling that all beings, myself and all others, are equal, fundamentally equal, in that we share that experience of constantly seeking happiness and trying to avoid problems. So in this analytical meditation, what we're trying to do is analyze whether we think that's true. And so you think about the other beings around you in your life and ask yourself whether you think that they are the same as you in this fundamental way. Is every moment of their life involved in or taken up with this pursuit of happiness and trying to avoid problems? So then you think about all the things that you've done in your life in the pursuit of happiness, all the things that you've tried since you're a child in trying to get happiness and to avoid problems. And think about how they have also been doing that all of their lives. So you start with thinking about the people who you are close to, your friends and family, and then you extend that out to include people who are further away, other people living in Australia or around the world, and also all other beings such as animals who are also the same in this way, sharing this fundamental experience. So this meditation on equanimity is aimed at overcoming the feeling of holding some people close and others distant, as seeing some people as more important or more valuable. So it's aimed at generating a feeling of all beings being equal, fundamentally equal. And then based on that feeling of equanimity, we generate the mind of compassion. So compassion is defined as the wish for beings to be free from suffering. And when we develop that further, we develop a wish to actually take action or help others to be free from suffering. So that's active compassion. So to generate compassion, we contemplate the various problems that other beings experience. Firstly, based on our own experience, we think of the various problems and difficulties that we have experienced in our life. And think about how others have experienced similar or the same types of problems. So, for example, you can contemplate various physical problems that you've experienced. Even small things like heat and cold and hunger and thirst. And fatigue and sickness, aging. So these are all things that we share, that all other beings have experienced. And then the various psychological or mental problems such as afflictive emotions like frustration, irritation, anger, and attachment, depression. So you think about how you've experienced those things throughout your life and how others have also experienced the same. So that's generating empathy or recognition that others share the same experience of having these types of problems. And then the mind of compassion is wishing that they would be free in the same way that you wish for yourself to be free of those problems. Compassion is the thought or wish that they also could be free from those problems. So once we've given rise or generated this feeling or this wish that others be free of suffering and problems, think how excellent it would be, or how great it would be if they could be free of all their problems. They could be completely free. And then compassion, taking compassion further or making it stronger, is taking some responsibility. Like the idea, like, I will do whatever I can to help others to be free from their various problems. So that's the mind of compassion. So once we've generated that, then we can use concentration to focus on that attitude or that feeling or that wish. So again, we use mindfulness to keep that wish in our mind, and alertness to check whether our mind has wandered. So just try to focus on that feeling or that wish, that attitude of compassion. And then if it fades or you lose it, then you can generate it again by using the same analysis, thinking of the reasons for compassion. Sometimes it helps to repeat a phrase, for example, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So to help keep it in mind, you could say that silently to yourself, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And then you can also use a visualization to strengthen this familiarity with this attitude of compassion. For example, you can imagine that light emanating from your heart and filling the beings around you and extending out to all living beings, and imagine that this light is completely removing or alleviating whatever problems they're experiencing. So just do that visualization. So you imagine light emanating from your heart, entering the beings around you, the humans and animals, completely pervading their mind and body and completely eliminating all of their problems. So again, while doing the visualization, we're using mindfulness to keep it in mind and alertness to check whether we've lost the object of concentration. So just try to hold that visualization for a minute or two. At the end of the meditation, you visualize that all beings have been completely freed from all of their various problems, and the light then absorbs back into your heart. And just end the meditation there. Okay, any questions or comments about that meditation? So that's a good example of analytical meditation followed by concentration. So you go through an analytical process and reach a conclusion, for example, the attitude of compassion, and then you use concentration to focus your mind on that attitude. And so that's the process of meditation, of training your mind or developing your mind through meditation, is familiarizing your mind with those kinds of positive attitudes. And compassion, particularly in Buddhism and also in many other spiritual traditions, is fundamental, and the main reason for that is because it's direct antidote or direct opponent to the, I guess, self-centered way of thinking that we generally have. And all of these afflictive emotions that we're talking about arise out of a strong sense or an exaggerated sense of I, or exaggerating the importance of the self. So that is one of the reasons why the practice of compassion is very central, I think, to probably all spiritual traditions, because it's directly counteracting that fundamental cause of our various problems. For example, anger arises out of a strong sense of I, as in I am being disrespected, or I am being harmed, so a strong sense of I, and then anger arises. So compassion is directly counteracting that, is expanding your sort of focus away from just the self to include all other beings, sort of expanded focus. Okay. So firstly, were you able to identify mindfulness and alertness during that meditation? You're able to do that? Yeah. And do you find that once you've identified them, that it's helpful for keeping your mind on the job, as in focused on that object? You can sort of, like when your mind starts to wander, you can see that it's happening and bring it back? Yeah. Yeah, so that's the idea. Yes, question. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So, did everyone hear that? That the doubt is raised whether everyone is doing everything they can to be happy. So I guess the Buddhist response to that would be what is stopping them from doing the best that they can? Because it's a very interesting point and a pertinent point. So if the suffering is stopping them, yeah. So they're not doing everything they can because something is stopping them. For example, suffering. So it might be suffering from depression or anxiety or greed. Yeah. Yeah, so that raises a very interesting idea, and it's one that comes up, I was going to mention later. The idea that we are, to a certain degree, or probably to a large degree, that we are limited or controlled by these kind of afflictive emotions, like greed, for example. So the idea is that if you had a choice between being greedy and not greedy, then being not greedy would be a much more happy or pleasant way to live, to be generous, and that greed itself is a form of suffering, or anxiety is a form of suffering, or so the things, these are like afflictive emotions and things that people would rather not have if given the choice. If you could experience greed and not greed, then you would find not greed much more pleasant, so you would choose that if you could. So that's what's stopping us from being happy. So it's not like we've really chosen to be greedy, it's just that we have greed is arising in our mind because of certain factors or causes. Do you agree? But don't you think, I mean, one response you could say, if they could do better, then they would. Do you agree? Because there's something stopping them. Yeah. Anyway, it's a very interesting debate, I think. And it comes down to the idea of compassion, you know. Does everyone deserve compassion? Are there some people who don't deserve compassion? But couldn't you argue that you're being restrained or limited by certain factors that are beyond your control? Yes. Subconscious. Yeah. No, I think probably the Buddhist view would be similar to that a lot of the thoughts and emotions we have are sort of arising out of a force of habit, and also they're arising because of mistaken ideas or views that we have about ourselves and the world. I guess the only thing that Buddhism would throw in is the idea that we have these strong imprints from previous lives as well. So that's why you might find in very young children have strong emotions or strong tendencies, you know, to behave in certain ways. But yeah, and I think getting back to your point, if you think about your own experience and times when you've done things that you really wish you hadn't done, that in that moment that your mind was sort of overwhelmed by a certain emotion, like anger, for example, and you've said things to someone that were really hurtful, and then even 10 minutes later you're wishing you hadn't said them, because in that moment your mind was sort of overwhelmed by anger. So that person would probably be thinking, you know, I really wish that Jeremy could do better and not say those things, and you know, and why doesn't he, you know, not say so do you see that point? Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think anger is a very good example and an obvious one. And some people have anger arising, you know, often, and it sort of can take over their lives and destroy all of their relationships and cause them huge amount of suffering. So I think given the choice, they would prefer not to have that anger. It's sort of taking over. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 So that's a very good point too. Yeah, yeah. So a lot of the problem with these afflictive emotions is we don't recognise the problems that they're causing us and the people around us. So that's, as you say, that's a form of ignorance where we haven't clearly seen how destructive these emotions are. Yeah. Yes.
Is that not why we come to these sessions and have these discussions to try and reduce our ignorance of what really makes us happy?
Yeah, so that's the idea, is that by focusing on these kinds of problems, these issues, and particularly also in our meditation, so you may meditate on anger itself, just allow it to arise in your mind, and then check up: is anger a good thing or a bad thing? Is it helping me or harming me? Is it helping others or harming others? So even just that simple analysis is very useful, because some people feel that anger is helpful and is serving them well, and then they can channel it and use that energy for productive purposes. So that's something we need to check out. So if we're looking at a afflictive emotion like anger or any afflictive emotion, that's the first thing we need to ask ourselves: is it an affliction? Is it causing us suffering and problems? So what do you think about anger? Do you think that anger can be a positive thing, or is it always negative? Right. Mm. Yeah. Mm. And do you think there would be other ways of achieving that goal, though? I mean, without anger? Mm. 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 Yeah, I think that's... Mm. Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. So, from the Buddhist point of view, anger is regarded as an afflictive emotion, and the main reason why it's regarded as an affliction is, firstly, because it damages our relationships with people around us if we express anger. Because anger is, well, the definition of anger in this context is a thought of sort of wanting to harm someone. So it's like an emotion that arises and sort of lash out at someone, sort of seeing them as the cause of a problem and sort of wanting to harm them. It's that kind of attitude. So that's obviously, and we've all experienced this, it's very damaging to our relationships with others around us. And because we're social beings, we need relationships, good relationships with others to be happy. So therefore it is harming us by damaging our relationships. So that would be one of the arguments that Buddhism puts forward as a problem with anger. Then another one is that it's disturbing our mind. So that's, I think, something we need to check up in our own meditation to see whether anger disturbs your mind or whether it doesn't disturb your mind. So when you've been angry, personally, I find that my mind is sort of disturbed, and even my body feels sort of uncomfortable. You sort of like heat in your chest, and you sort of feel sort of knotted up. But that's something to, examine in your own experience. And so in terms of also meditation, if we're trying to develop concentration and practice meditation, then afflictive emotions like anger disturb the mind and make it difficult to focus. So it's an obstacle to meditation or spiritual practice. If you're trying to develop compassion and patience, and anger, when it arises, disturbs your mind. So, yeah, from a Buddhist point of view, anger is regarded as a strongly afflictive emotion. But as I said, that's something you need to check up in your own experience to see whether you agree with that.
I'm on the sexual assault centre and we run survivors groups.
Yeah.
People who survived childhood sexual abuse. And I've been thinking about this anger issue for about 2 years now, because at sessions 3 or 4, we teach people to get angry with the perpetrator, not with themselves. Because often people have quite destructive behaviour because they're angry with themselves. And I keep trying to work out whether there's a better way to do that, because we actually do teach them to get angry, as opposed to being just passive or destructive.
Yeah.
And ever since I started coming in, just more than a couple of years ago, I keep thinking there has to be another way to do this session. I struggle with it.
Yeah. So in that context, how is it explained that the anger is helpful for those people?
It's sort of explained that it's far better that you blame the perpetrator for what's happened than you blame yourself for not having stopped what was happening. And that's often what people do. They say, well, it's my fault because I didn't do these things. And we say, no, if you're going to direct anger, and that often is anger, because they're often cutting themselves and things, then it's better that you direct some anger towards whom in fact abused you. Even with infinite compassion doesn't seem to quite fit in that state.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point too. Because as you say, like sometimes it's so difficult to be compassionate towards someone, especially if they've harmed you in that way. But so I guess the idea, and we're talking about patience, practicing patience and dealing with anger. I guess the idea is that we sort of need to do it gradually, and maybe the gradual step would be firstly that kind of idea of equanimity, where you see that yourself and that the perpetrator are not entirely, that you have some commonality, and also the idea that your own mind is overwhelmed by afflictive emotions at times, in the same way others are. For example, that perpetrator. But I guess, as you say, maybe that's too much, for someone who's been really harmed in that way.
True that people, there's some people who've had an experience like that, actually have a history themselves of having experienced abuse, sexual abuse, and I guess maybe that's something we have to read.
Yeah.
But I found this for a long while something I struggle with, because I know that's what we do, people running groups do, and I keep thinking maybe there is a better way to do this, and comes out really simply.
Yeah, but maybe it is a process, as you say, it's better to be directing anger towards others rather than that yourself, and then so maybe you develop from there, and eventually you can develop more understanding of that the perpetrator's state of mind or the reasons that have caused them to do that. Like you say, they may have been harmed themselves. So the aim, from the Buddhist point of view, the aim would be to have compassion for all beings, including people who perpetrate that kind of harm. But I certainly can appreciate that it would be very difficult in some circumstances like that. So I think also a point there is that we need to be to work with our minds as they are, and not have unrealistic expectations, to suddenly expect ourselves to feel compassion, to completely change from anger to compassion. So it's a gradual process that we develop gradually. Yes, sorry, well, you had a question?
My interpretation of the Buddhist text in this regard would suggest that people and stories and life fictions which we create for ourselves in the corner of the study.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a very important practice, which is the idea of keeping your mind in the present moment and dealing with what's happening in the present, and trying not to dwell overly on the past or think about the future. And so the reason for that, one is that because the past and the future we don't have much control over, and we do have much more control over the present and our present state of mind particularly, and our present actions. So it makes, I think, life much more simple and manageable if you can focus on this present moment. So you only have this much to deal with, because if you think about all the stuff that's happened in the past, it's a huge thing and can sort of overwhelm you, whereas the present moment can be much more manageable. And then the future, like a lot of anxiety comes about from thinking about the future or the things that might go wrong in the future. But we'd have, only limited control over a lot of those things, and much better to focus on the present. So that is an important technique, especially for dealing with these kind of afflictive emotions. So focusing on when anger arises, you just think about the anger and what's coming up and why it's come up, and focus on what can I do right in this moment to deal with the anger as it's arising. Yeah. So it's an important point. Yes.
I think it also depends on the intention behind the anger as well, which is what I'm trying to get to. Or if it's like a self-serving type of point scoring type of post my thoughts of a person because that's the way I am and I want to prove this particular point.
Yeah.
Then the intention is not a helpful one, it's a harmful
Yeah.
intention. If your intention with the anger is to, I guess it's more of a protective type anger, such as if you were standing up for a class of people or animals or something like that, who've been harmed by making that voice, or in the case of the lady who was talking about before, with that anger, you're actually protecting your younger self. That's the intention of directing that anger back to the other person. The protection of that smaller person, or that person who is unempowered or out of control.
Yeah. So I think it comes a bit down to definitions here too, because as I was saying before, the idea of anger is a thought wishing to harm others. So what you're talking about may not even be anger, I think. Like if you have a strong feeling of wanting to protect others, or protect, that may not be anger, because you're not aiming to harm someone.
But you get that passionate feeling which feels like anger toward the person, even though you're not directing it towards one individual.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we need to analyze these emotions. I think that's the point, and see, is this anger or not? So it can be a very strong energy coming up, and then you need to check up, is this energy angry, or is it helpful, or is it a mixture of both? I remember one person saying when they get angry, they get so much energy and they can clean the whole house, and they feel, well, that must be good. That's useful. Otherwise, I wouldn't get around to cleaning the house. I get angry with my husband, then I go and clean the whole house. And a friend of mine I used to live with, who was really into like punk rock music. This is years back, and he used to just get into his room and thrash out on the guitar. And he said, I just love the angry feeling, and I just sort of channel it into my music. So you sort of need to analyze, there's the energy, and then there's the intention, as you said, and then there's is it wishing to harm someone? So you need to analyze, and often it's sort of all mixed up. Yeah, yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. So you can think about directing the anger at the anger, or at the harmful intent in that person's mind. So that's sort of the real enemy. just before we run out of time, there were two things I wanted to explain. There were two main practices for dealing with anger, and we've kind of been talking about them indirectly. But that's one of them, which is based on compassion. It's normally called the practice, the patience of non-retaliation. So it's recognizing that the harm that someone else perpetrates towards you is motivated by their own afflictive emotions. And so the idea is that because they're overwhelmed by these afflictive emotions, which are a form of suffering and are causing them to perform harmful actions, that they are actually an object of deserving compassion. And the analogy is used, if someone hits you with a stick, then you don't get angry with the stick because it's being wielded by the arm. So in the same way as the stick is wielded by the arm, then the person is also being wielded by their afflictive emotions. And so you might think, well, that's just sort of, maybe letting them off too lightly. They need to take responsibility for their emotions. Then you think about the times when you've been harmful to others and how you've been overwhelmed by those afflictive emotions and done things that in your right mind or in your peaceful mind you wouldn't have done those things. So you've been overwhelmed in those moments. So that's the idea, is to have compassion for the person, and to see, as you're saying, to see the problem is the afflictive emotions within their mind which is causing that problem. So that's the patience of what's called patience of non-retaliation. So it's based on the practice of compassion, recognizing that all beings have these afflictive emotions and they get overwhelmed by them and they perform harmful actions motivated by them. So that's one practice of patience, which I think is a very challenging idea and requires quite a lot of familiarity with compassion. The other practice of patience, which I wanted to talk about tonight, is it's called the practice of, I guess you'd say, transforming problems, or it's sometimes called voluntarily experiencing difficulties. So the idea with this practice is to see that difficult situations, problematic situations, actually have quite a lot of potential for being helpful for us. So you think, for example, of a difficult situation like someone speaking harshly or insultingly to you, and think, how can this situation be helpful for me? Because normally our reaction is just to think, this is terrible, how dare they talk to me like that, I deserve respect and I don't deserve to be treated like that, and I'm going to shut them down as quickly as possible and make it clear to them that they can't treat me in this way. So that's our kind of normal reaction. But the practice of patience is to look at the situation as thinking, how can this situation be helpful for me? And the idea is that by experiencing difficult situations, we can develop greater tolerance. So this is the idea of familiarizing your mind with difficult situations and gradually becoming more and more tolerant of them. So you can see in your own experience how some things that you used to find really difficult are actually now not difficult at all for you. So since when you were a young child, for example, and you find some things are very difficult, and now, like going to work, for example. So when you become an adult and you have to work, 7 or 8 hours a day, and it's, a 7-hour day is not such a big deal. But when you're young and you start working in a 3-hour shift in a cafe or whatever, just seems really hard. So you can see in your own experience how things can become just easier through acquaintance. So it's the same idea with this practice of patience, is that by experiencing these kind of difficulties, and when you're experiencing the difficulty, you think, this is, just focus on the feeling of it. How difficult is this? How painful is this? For example, you're driving in traffic and someone yells something abusive at you, and just think, well, how much is that actually hurting me? Is that really a great suffering, or is it just, a slight discomfort? And so you think about the problem, the difficulty you're experiencing, and then think, well, is it possible for me to just remain undisturbed by that? is that something I really have to get upset about? So the idea is that you become gradually more and more tolerant of these sort of discomforts and analyze whether they are actually as harmful as we instinctively feel. So the Buddha used the analogy of when someone insults us, it's like someone shooting an arrow at us, and the arrow hits us and then falls to the ground. But what we do is we pick up the arrow and we keep stabbing ourselves with it by thinking again and again about how dare they, reminding ourselves of that suffering. So thinking about it over and over again. So really, the idea is that we're exaggerating the seriousness of the harm or the threat. So this practice of transforming the problem or voluntarily experiencing the problem is based on that idea of thinking that these difficult situations can actually be very useful for us. Something that we can use to make ourselves more tolerant, more sort of develop more strength of mind. And it can be helpful, I think, to visualize yourself as remaining calm. In some texts they talk about thinking of yourself as a great tree, a huge tree. So someone might be attacking you or insulting you with angry words, for example. You visualize yourself as this great sort of immovable tree and just think I'm this strong, powerful, immovable object which can just take this kind of problems without getting disturbed. So that's the idea with that practice, which I think is very helpful, particularly with dealing with anger. Yeah, so anger is said to be based on, one of the causes of anger is the idea of exaggerating the threat, or exaggerating the harm, or exaggerating the bad qualities of another person. So there's a factor of exaggerating. So again, that's something we need to check up. Is that true or not? So those are the two main techniques. There's another one which is, I think, more difficult to do with meditating on emptiness. Emptiness of the person who's harming you, emptiness of yourself, and emptiness of the harm they're doing you there. So they're called the three spheres. So that's more difficult to explain. I think these other two practices of voluntarily experiencing difficulties, so sort of like I think I mentioned last week, when you've achieved mastery in that practice, it said that you would welcome problems. So when problems happen, you would see them as something useful and good. You say, okay, this is good, I can use this. And so that changes, I think, quite dramatically our general approach to our life, where we're constantly trying to avoid problems, and that can actually cause quite a lot of anxiety, where we're constantly trying to avoid problems, avoid confrontation. So if you can see problems as being somehow useful, difficult situations, then I think sort of opens your mind, up more, so you don't get so easily upset. What do you think about that idea? Transforming or welcoming problems, voluntarily experiencing difficulties. It might sound a bit perverse. Sorry, say that again. Yeah. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that? How is it the premise for spiritual awakening?
And you see it as an opportunity for transformation as opposed to something that's going to kill you and it's just horrendous. Then it's an opportunity for spiritual awakening.
Yeah, so it gives, I think, so it really changes your attitude or your position in that situation to one of being, rather than being a victim, of being someone that actually has the power to use that situation. for your own benefit, you know. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so that would be the ideal outcome, where you can transform that problem so it's beneficial for yourself as well as for that other person. Yeah. So certainly if you're not acting out of anger, then there's much more freedom for you to also be trying to help that person as well. Yeah.
What you were saying though really depends on context. Like the example you gave of someone saying something in traffic or you driving past them is fine. If there's something much more serious happening, that approach may not necessarily work.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, and I think again it's we have to sort of work with our own ability, I think. So some problems may be just too overwhelming, and it's better just to remove yourself from that situation entirely. So I had a situation at work recently where one of the people I was sitting next to was just constantly criticizing me all the time, and it was just getting ridiculous. So when I was on the phone, he would be criticizing me. So I was thinking, well, you know, as a Buddhist, I should really be dealing with this and transforming it into, you know, into something useful. But I couldn't even really get my work done. I couldn't really think straight. So I asked, you know, the manager to move me to 30 meters away to another desk. So it's just made it more manageable. And so, you know, there's still sort of a difficult relationship I have with this guy, but it's much more manageable for me. So now I can sort of start to, you know, use it in a more productive way, I think. Yeah. So, yeah. So we've got to be realistic about our own. I think we're all sort of beginners in these practices. We can't sort of be, can't be too ambitious. Have to be realistic. Yeah. Okay, so out of time now. So I just, just to recap. So we talked about two practices of patience, which is the patience of non-retaliation, which is based on compassion, and the patience of voluntarily accepting difficulties, or and also the idea of, or the question of whether anger is an afflictive emotion. So that's something that we need to check up. And also again to remind you of mindfulness and alertness. So in meditation, mindfulness is remembering the object, and alertness is checking the meditation to see whether your mind has wandered. So I encourage you to experiment with those, you know, in your own meditation practice, even if you do a few minutes a day throughout the week, and see how you go with that. Okay, thank you for your time. Feel free to stay for tea in the dining room.